Hello everyone, this is King Gratz here. Welcome back to the channel, guys. I'm back again with another swap streak video, but this time focusing on the world of basketball. I've been really interested to see the history of trades in the NBA, mainly because they're just a lot more complicated and there's just so many moving parts most of the time, and especially the rules are a little bit complex. One big trade in the NBA can have a long-lasting effect, not just for the two franchises that could be involved in the trade, but for many other franchises in the NBA for years to come. And so in this video, I'm essentially trying to explain how one trade in particular that happened back in 2019 essentially warped NBA history forever, because it wasn't just the two teams in the original trade that were heavily impacted, but it was also a number of other organizations that were impacted in the years following this trade leading up to the present day, and certainly will be impacted for years to come from now. This entire video is focusing on Anthony Davis, an NBA player, and I therefore titled this video the Anthony Davis Swap Streak. So Anthony Davis was a former first overall selection in the NBA draft. He was drafted in 2012 by the New Orleans Pelicans. He was supposed to be a core piece of their rebuild, a traditional center who has massive length and height, a guy who is very solid defensively, and he's also developed a very good offensive game. This guy can basically kind of do everything, well-rounded on offense when it comes to like the pick and roll, trying to drive the lane into the net. He can shoot threes, pretty much everything you can ask for in a guy of his caliber and talent. Unfortunately for New Orleans, things didn't really pan out in the rebuild, as AD's Pelicans were essentially mediocrity for most of the time, and unfortunately the team decided to transition into a new rebuild, and as a result Anthony Davis was one of the many pieces involved in trades as part of the teardown process for New Orleans. And so this kicks off his initial trade history and basically how this entire video begins. So Anthony Davis was traded in the 2019 offseason to the LA Lakers in exchange for Lonzo Ball, Brandon Ingram, and Josh Hart, and 4 first-round picks. Now, some of these first-round picks have already been conveyed to the Pelicans. One of these picks was protected, another one was conditional, which was for 2025, and a pick swap in 2023. Now, it should be noted that not all of the parts going to New Orleans actually got swapped over. For example, in 2023, the first round pick that the Lakers were supposed to send over was a swap option, and the Pelicans did not decide to swap out the pick. So therefore, the Lakers actually get to keep their 2023 first, in which they used to select Jalen Hood-Schifino, so we don't have to worry about that part in this segment of the video. In addition, the first round pick in 2025, that is going to be sent over to the Pelicans, because that was an option that New Orleans had. And of course, the 2019 and 2022 picks were also sent over to New Orleans as part of this trade. So let's look into all of the major pieces now. Let's look at the easy parts here. To begin, on New Orleans side of things, Brandon Ingram probably is the easiest part of this entire block, because Ingram would spend a number of years with the Pelicans before he eventually got traded as part of their existing teardown, in which he was sent to the Toronto Raptors in exchange for veterans Bruce Brown Jr. and Kelly Olynyk, a first-round pick that was protected for 2026, and Toronto's second-round pick in 2031. At this point in time, Ingram was supposed to be a free agent this offseason, but he did sign a 4-year extension with the Raptors, so essentially he keeps this thing going. Bruce Brown is a UFA at the end of the year, while Kelly Olynyk, I believe, has another year on his contract right now, and the Pelicans still own both of these draft picks, but we're still at least a years away from figuring out whatever these picks become. Lonzo Ball, on the other hand, he would spend a little bit of time in New Orleans before he was later involved in a trade where his rights were traded to the Chicago Bulls for Thomas Satoransky, the rights to Garrett Temple, cash considerations, and a second-round pick in 2024. Lonzo Ball is still with the Bulls to this day. Satoransky will be involved in some other trades in his career, which I will bring up later in this video. Garrett Temple never got traded again. The second-round pick, interestingly enough, was involved in a few other trades. So first of all, it was later flipped to the San Antonio Spurs, along with Devontae Graham and a couple of other second-round picks in exchange for Josh Richardson. Josh Richardson never got traded again from the Pelicans. Devontae Graham was later involved in a separate trade where the Spurs sent him to the Charlotte Hornets along with a second-round pick in 2025 for an unknown amount of cash value, so essentially that ends the line right there, and Graham never got traded again. The second-round pick that I'm still talking about was used to select Adam Bona, but as you may recall, he ends up actually getting drafted by the 76ers. How that happens is essentially because this pick was later rerouted to the Boston Celtics in a 3-team trade where this pick goes to Boston from San Antonio, along with the Dallas Mavericks sending a second rounder in 2025 and 2030 to Boston in exchange for the rights to Grant Williams. The Spurs also gave up 2 second-round picks to the Mavericks, and the Mavericks would send back to San Antonio Reggie Bullock and a first-round pick swap in 2030. Of course, this is still a very early trade. Technically, a lot of the draft picks haven't been determined yet, so technically I have to kind of end it right there. Reggie Bullock never got traded from San Antonio. Grant Williams, however, was later flipped by the Mavericks in a capped-up move to the Charlotte Hornets, along with Seth Curry in a protected first-round pick in 2027 in exchange for PJ Washington and 2 second-round picks. PJ Washington is still a part of Dallas to this day. Grant Williams and Seth Curry are still with the Charlotte Hornets, along with that first-round pick, so we don't have to worry about that. One of the second-round picks that was in 2024 that went to the Mavericks was used to select Ariel Hukporti. This pick technically got traded again. This time it went to the New York Knicks along with Petteri Koponen in exchange for another second-round pick in 2024, which the Mavericks used to select Melvin Ajinka. Ajinka hasn't made an impact at the NBA level whatsoever, while Ariel Hukporti, I believe, is a bench warmer right now for the Knicks, and that's pretty much all I could say there. The 2028 second that went to the Mavs with PJ Washington is conditional, but we still have a number of years to go before that is ultimately figured out. Now, carrying on here, Josh Hart, he has his own very sophisticated trade history. So after spending some time in New Orleans, he was later involved in a huge trade going to the Portland Trail Blazers, along with Thomas Satoransky, who I mentioned earlier, and a young Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Didi Louzada, and a first-round pick in 2025 and 2 second-round picks, one in 2026 and 2027. In exchange, the Pelicans would acquire CJ McCollum, Larry Nance Jr., and Tony Snell. Interestingly enough, the easiest part of this entire trade is Tony Snell because he never got traded again, and CJ McCollum was supposed to be another big piece for the Pelicans in their existing roster. Of course, the Pelicans are once again transitioning into another rebuild, but we'll come back to that later in this video. For Satoransky, he would be involved in some more trades along with Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Didi Louzada, I will bring up his name later in this video because he is involved in another trade. But following this, Larry Nance Jr. was later flipped by the Pelicans to the Atlanta Hawks, along with Dyson Daniels, EJ Liddell, Cody Zeller, a first in 2025, and a conditional first rounder in 2027, all for DeJounte Murray. Dyson Daniels was actually drafted by the Pelicans with the 2022 first round pick they got back for Anthony Davis. So essentially, him and Larry Nance Jr. are connected here, and they both went to Atlanta. For Dyson Daniels, he has still had a pretty good time with Atlanta right now, definitely improving his game. Larry Nance hasn't been traded again. EJ Liddell would later get flipped to the Phoenix Suns for David Roddy, while Cody Zeller was later flipped to the Houston Rockets along with a second round pick in 2028 for Alpha Kaba, which in my opinion just sounds like one of those university fraternities or something, so I didn't know that was a person, so I apologize. DeJounte Murray is still with the New Orleans Pelicans to this day, so technically that keeps things going, and the first round picks are still with the Hawks. Returning back to this big trade, Thomas Satoransky and Nickeil Alexander-Walker would later be involved in a 3-team trade after the trade to the Blazers. Satoransky would go to the San Antonio Spurs from Portland. A second-round pick would then be sent to the Spurs from Utah. Nickeil Alexander-Walker would go to Utah along with Juancho Hernan-Gomez from San Antonio, and the Blazers would acquire Joe Ingles, Elijah Hughes, and a second-round pick in 2022, which they used to select Jabari Walker. Jabari Walker is a part of the existing rebuild for Portland, so he is a mainstay right there right now. Joe Ingles and Elijah Hughes never got traded again, and for Thomas Satoransky, this also ends his trade history as well, and the Spurs still own this second round pick in 2027. For Juancho Hernan-Gomez, he does have his own sophisticated trade history. I will probably bring this up later in this video. For Nickeil Alexander-Walker, on the other hand, he would be involved in later a big-time trade in which he would go to the Minnesota Timberwolves along with veteran Mike Conley and 2 second-round picks. You have the Lakers sending Russell Westbrook, Damian Jones, and Juan Toscano Anderson and a first-round pick in 2027 to the Utah Jazz. The Lakers would also send a second-round pick in 2024 to Minnesota, while the Lakers would pick up D'Angelo Russell from the Timberwolves and Malik Beasley and Jared Vanderbilt from the Jazz. This was technically all part of Russell Westbrook essentially not being a good fit for the Lakers, and he had to essentially get dumped to a team. The Jazz were willing to do that. Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Mike Conley are still with the Timberwolves to this day. So are all of these second-round picks, except for the one with the Lakers that actually got traded a couple of times. It was involved in a 4-team trade where this pick ultimately went to the Detroit Pistons along with Wendell Moore Jr., and this pick was used to select Bobby Klintman, who is still with Detroit. Minnesota would get back from this trade $1 million cash in a 2030 second rounder, and Memphis and Toronto would tag in here, in which they would also get 1 second-round pick each. Memphis got a pick in 2024, which turned into Cam Spencer, and Toronto would get a second-rounder that turned into Ulrich Chomsky. For the Jazz, they would later buy out Russell Westbrook, who would then leave as a free agent. Damian Jones was later flipped for future considerations to the Cleveland Cavaliers. Juan Toscano Anderson never got traded again, and the first-round pick is protected, but it is still with the Utah Jazz. Malik Beasley and Jared Vanderbilt both would spend some time with the Lakers. Beasley would leave as a free agent, while Vanderbilt is now a bench warmer with the LA Lakers, at least at this point in time. D'Angelo Russell would later get involved in another trade, in which he was then flipped to the Brooklyn Nets, along with Maxwell Lewis and 3 second-round picks for Dorian Finney-Smith and Shake Milton. This is a fairly recent trade, and nobody has moved since then, and of course the Nets still own all of these second-round picks. Josh Hart, he would get traded again, this time going from the Portland Trail Blazers, and was part of a 14 trade in which Hart, along with Danny Diaz and Bojan Dubuljevic, would go from Portland to the New York Knicks. In exchange, the Blazers would get back from the Knicks Cam Reddish, Ryan Arcidiacono, Ante Tomic, and a first-round pick in 2023. The 76ers and the Charlotte Hornets would get involved in this trade, where the Knicks would send Svi Mykhailiuk to the Hornets, and Philadelphia would pick up Jalen McDaniels, a second-round pick from Charlotte, and a second-round pick in 2029 from Portland, and the Blazers would pick up Matisse Thybulle from Philadelphia. There are still some moving parts here, but also a lot of kind of dead ends. For Philadelphia, Jalen McDaniels would leave as a free agent. The second-round pick that they got from Charlotte turned into Cam Spencer, which I mentioned would go to ultimately Memphis in a future trade. They still own the second-round pick in 2029. The Blazers, Cam Reddish, Ryan Arcidiacono, and Ante Tomic never got traded again, so you can end that right there. Matisse Thybulle is still part of the team though, and the first-round pick in 2023 they used to select Chris Murray, who is part of their current rebuild. For the Knicks, Josh Hart would become a big-time role player in the Knicks organization. Danny Diaz would later get flipped back to Portland along with 3 second-round picks, 1 in 2027, 29, and 2030. And all of this was in exchange for a 2024 second that turned into Tyler Kolek. Of course, Kolek hasn't amounted to anything at the NBA level, and Bojan Dubuljevic never got traded again. And then for Charlotte, Svi Mykhailiuk never got traded again after this. The second they got back from Philadelphia turned into Colby Jones. This pick actually traded hands a bunch more times, but I won't really go into it, so don't worry about it. And they still own the 2027 second-round pick that they got from Portland. Now, let's go into the draft picks. So the 2019 first-round pick that the Pelicans got for Anthony Davis turned into DeAndre Hunter. DeAndre Hunter didn't spend much time in New Orleans because he was later involved in a big trade, going to the Atlanta Hawks along with Solomon Hill, Jordan Bone, and a second-round pick in 2023 in exchange for Jackson Hayes, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Didi Louzada, and 2 second-round picks, 1 in 2021 and 2022, which turned into Herb Jones and Vince Williams Jr. respectively. Now, looking at all of these pieces, There are a couple of duds here. For the Pelicans side of things, Jackson Hayes and Didi Louzada never got traded again after this. Nickeil Alexander-Walker, as I mentioned, was already involved in the earlier trades that I talked about going to Minnesota and beyond. This essentially began his trade history, so I won't go through that again. For the Hawks, however, they would go through a couple of future trades with the pieces they got back. Solomon Hill was later flipped to the New York Knicks, along with Cam Reddish and a second-round pick in 2025 in exchange for Kevin Knox and 2 second-rounders, one in 2026 and another in 2027. Kevin Knox never got traded again, and the Hawks still own these 2 picks. Cam Reddish, of course, as I mentioned, was involved in a later trade where we saw him go to the Blazers as the Josh Hart deal, and Solomon Hill never got traded again after this. And of course, the Knicks still own the second rounder in 2025. Moving on now, Jordan Bone was later sent in another trade. This time he went all the way to the Philadelphia 76ers, along with 2 second-round picks, one in 2020 and another in 2023, all for the signing rights to Bruno Fernando. Second-round pick in 2023 that turned into Seth Lundy for the Hawks was never traded. Lundy didn't really amount to anything at the NBA level. For the Sixers, the second-round picks they got from the Hawks for Fernando turned into Colby Jones and Theo Maledon. Maledon would bounce around the NBA, but he didn't really get traded much. And Colby Jones, he, of course, as I mentioned, that pick got flipped around to a bunch of other teams. And Jordan Bone, his trade history ends with a trade to the Detroit Pistons, all for a second-round pick and cash considerations. That second-rounder turned into Nikola Durcic, who, of course, hasn't done much at the NBA level, so it's still pretty much a dead end. And we don't know what the cash considerations are, but we don't really have to worry about it. Bruno Fernando, on the other hand, he was involved in a few other trades. Next up, he went in a 3-team trade to the Boston Celtics, along with Chris Dunn and a second-round pick in 2023. The Sacramento Kings would tag into this deal, sending DeLon Wright to the Atlanta Hawks, and Tristan Thompson, acquired by Sacramento from Boston. DeLon Wright never got traded again. The second-round pick in 2023 turned into Julian Phillips, who hasn't amounted to really anything at the NBA level, so don't worry about it. I'll come back to Chris Dunn because he is involved in some other trades after this. Bruno Fernando after this was later flipped to the Houston Rockets as part of a big trade in which he was sent along with Enes Freedom and Dennis Schroeder in exchange for Daniel Tice. Tice, of course, never got traded from Boston after this. Schroeder and Enes Freedom also never got traded again after this, so that pretty much ends the line for those guys. Fernando was then later flipped in another trade, this time going back to the Atlanta Hawks alongside Garrison Matthews, and in exchange the Rockets would acquire Justin Holiday, Frank Kaminsky, and 2 second-round picks. One of the second-rounders would turn into Ulrich Chomsky, which of course eventually went to the Raptors. The other second-round pick would be retained by Houston at this point. Kaminsky and Holiday never got traded again, and for Bruno Fernando, this basically ends his trade history as he would start to middle around the NBA and start bouncing around, and Garrison Matthews is still with the Hawks. Now carrying on here, recall Tristan Thompson, because he was later involved in a big blockbuster move in which the Sacramento Kings would send him along with Buddy Hield and Tyrese Halliburton to the Indiana Pacers in exchange for Domantas Sabonis, Jeremy Lamb, and Justin Holiday, and a second-round pick in 2023. Of course, Tyrese Halliburton has had a fantastic career so far with the Pacers and helping that franchise this year get back to the Eastern Conference Finals. Tristan Thompson was sort of a minor piece in this entire deal, and Buddy Hield would stick around in Indiana for some time and would provide a very important three-point presence over there. Domantas Sabonis would, of course, have a significant role for the Sacramento Kings, even to this day, helping the franchise return at the playoffs. Jeremy Lamb was a more limited piece, but he never got traded again. Justin Holiday, he was involved in a later trade as he was basically sent this time to the Atlanta Hawks along with Maurice Harkless and a first-round pick in 2025 for Kevin Huerter. I'll return to Kevin Huerter later in this video. Jordan Walsh, who was drafted with the 2023 second-round pick, he hasn't amounted to anything at the NBA level, so don't worry about him. And for Justin Holiday, after being sent to the Hawks, he was later involved in that trade going to Houston involving Bruno Fernando that I talked about. And the first-round pick in 2025 did get transferred over to the Atlanta Hawks as a result of this year's draft lottery. Now, Maurice Harkless would be involved in his own trade history, as he was later flipped to the Oklahoma City Thunder along with 2 second-round picks, one in 2025, the other in 2029, in exchange for Vit Krejci. Krejci is still with the Hawks right now. For the Thunder, they would later flip Maurice Harkless in a big cap dump move, sending him along with Derek Favors, Ty Jerome, and Theo Maledon, along with a second-round pick in 2026 and cash considerations to the Houston Rockets in exchange for David Nwaba, Trey Burke, Sterling Brown, and Marquise Chris. A lot of these guys never got traded again. Ty Jerome, Theo Maledon, Derek Favors, and all 4 guys that went to OKC never got traded again after this trade. For Maurice Harkless, this also basically ends his trade history as well, and the second round pick is still owned by the Rockets. One last thing, Kevin Huerter, he went to the Kings after going from Atlanta. He was recently involved in that big blockbuster trade in which De'Aaron Fox went to the San Antonio Spurs and Zach LaVine went from the Bulls to the Sacramento Kings. Kevin Huerter ends up going to Chicago along with Zach Collins, Trey Jones, and a first-round pick in 2025. Zach LaVine would go to Sacramento along with 3 second-round picks, one in 26, 27, and 28, respectively. And the Spurs would pick up De'Aaron Fox with Jordan McLaughlin from Sacramento in exchange for Sidy Cissoko, a second in 25, a first-rounder in 2027 and 2031, and a second in 2028. Of course, this is still fairly new of a trade, and none of the players nor draft picks have been moved so far, so essentially this one is in limbo. And then moving on here, last but not least, DeAndre Hunter was later flipped to the Cleveland Cavaliers at this year's trade deadline after a number of years in Atlanta for Karis LeVert, George Niang, 3 second-round picks, and 2 pick swaps. Of course, this is still fairly new. DeAndre Hunter would be involved in the Cleveland Cavaliers' playoff run this year, but ultimately they were a second-round exit, and that ended their season. Karis LeVert and George Niang, I'm not really sure what their future looks like in Atlanta, considering that the team is kind of stuck in mediocrity right now. I'm not sure if they transition into a rebuild, but either way, this is pretty much the end of the line right here for DeAndre Hunter and his side of the story. Going back to that original big trade of DeAndre Hunter going to Atlanta, let's now look at the draft picks that the Pelicans got back in this deal. So Herb Jones, he is still with New Orleans. He was drafted by the Pelicans, and he would become a notable member of the team's core. The other draft pick in 2022 was used to select Vince Williams Jr., in which he was actually drafted by the Grizzlies, and that's because this pick actually got sent in a 3-team trade to Memphis, along with another second-round pick in 2025 from New Orleans, and the signing rights to Jared Butler, Zaire Williams, Steven Adams, and of course cap dump Eric Bledsoe. The Pelicans would acquire Jonas Valanciunas and the rights to Brandon Boston Jr. and Trey Murphy III from Memphis, and also Charlotte would tag in here, getting Wes Iwundu, a first-round pick in 2022, which turned into Mark Williams, by the way, and $1 in cash, and the signing rights to Tyler Harvey from Memphis. In exchange, they gave up Devontae Graham to New Orleans. Some parts didn't really move much here. Vince Williams Jr., of course, was drafted by the Grizzlies and is currently a role player with the organization. Jared Butler never got traded again. Steven Adams would later get involved in a separate trade in which he was later sent by the Grizzlies to the Houston Rockets for Victor Oladipo and 3 second-round picks. One of those picks, once again, was Ulrich Chomsky, who I mentioned was sent to the Raptors. Jalen Wells was drafted with a 2024 second-round pick, and there's still a conditional second-rounder in 2025 that the Grizzlies still own. For Oladipo, he never got traded again after this. Now going back to the big 3-team trade for the Pelicans, Brandon Boston Jr. and Trey Murphy III would sign with New Orleans, and they are still with the organization to this day. I already mentioned Devontae Graham earlier in this video. He would get flipped to another organization, but it's not entirely connected to this initial 3-team trade, so don't worry about it. Tyler Harvey didn't sign with Charlotte, so that pretty much ends that. Mark Williams was supposed to get traded to the LA Lakers, if you recall, in this year's trade deadline, but that trade got nixed by the NBA, so he is still with Charlotte to this day. And Wes Iwundu never got traded from Charlotte. Zaire Williams, on the other hand, he was later flipped by Memphis to the Brooklyn Nets, along with a second-round pick in 2030 for Mamadi Diakite and Nemanja Dangubic. Of course, both those guys going to Memphis hasn't been traded since. Zaire Williams would stick around in Brooklyn for the time being, and that second-round pick hasn't been traded so far. Valanciunas would later go from the Pelicans to the Washington Wizards for a second-round pick in 2027 that's protected, and Valanciunas would help the Wizards out in the rebuild as he was later flipped as a rental to Sacramento Kings for City Sissoko and 2 second-round picks, one in 2028, the other in 2029. Next part, I want to call this the Beverley connection, because this is all involving Patrick Beverley. Patrick Beverley, of course, is an NBA veteran. He has been in the NBA for a long time. His trade history is pretty much connected to this entire video, and this really all has to do with Eric Bledsoe. So Eric Bledsoe, after going to Memphis as part of that 3-team trade with Charlotte and New Orleans, he was later flipped to the LA Clippers for Patrick Beverley, Rajon Rondo, and Daniel Oturu. Oturu and Rondo never got traded again, so don't worry about them. I'll come back to Bledsoe later in this video, but Patrick Beverley, this would then kick off a cascade of trades in his career, and some of them were impactful, others not so much. So first of all, Beverley would later get flipped by Memphis, this time going to the Minnesota Timberwolves for Juancho Hernan-Gomez and Jarrett Culver. Of course, this would then begin the trade history of Juancho Hernan-Gomez. Jarrett Culver never got traded again. Patrick Beverley would later get involved in a blockbuster deal where he was sent to the Utah Jazz along with Malik Beasley, Jared Vanderbilt, Leandro Bolmaro, and Walker Kessler, and 4 first-round picks, all for Rudy Gobert going to Minnesota. Of course, this was a huge blockbuster deal, and there were some moving parts here for Utah. I mentioned Malik Beasley and Jared Vanderbilt going to the LA Lakers as part of the Russell Westbrook trade going back to Utah. Leandro Bolmaro never got traded again, while Walker Kessler would be signed by the Jazz and is their starting center in their existing rebuild right now. The first round pick in 2023 that went to Utah turned into Keontae George, who is a good youngster over there, and the other first round picks, of course, are left to be determined. Patrick Beverley, after going to Utah, he was later flipped to the LA Lakers for Talen Horton-Tucker, Stanley Johnson. For Beverley, he wouldn't spend much time in LA, as he was later involved in a 4-team trade up above here, in which he was later sent to the Orlando Magic along with $2 million cash. The Lakers would get Mo Bamba from Orlando, Devon Reed would go from the Nuggets to the Lakers, and the Clippers would tag in here, picking up Bones Highland from Denver, and in exchange they sent 2 second-round picks to the LA Lakers. Interestingly enough, one of these picks turned into Bronny James in 2024. The other pick is in 2025. For the Nuggets, they would also pick up Thomas Bryant from the Lakers, and of course got some trade exceptions on Bones Highland and Devon Reed. And for Beverley, this pretty much ends his trade history. He never got traded again, and that pretty much ends the Beverley connection. Now, returning to this trade of Juancho Hernan-Gomez and Jarrett Culver for Patrick Beverley, Hernan-Gomez's trade history essentially begins here. After this trade, he was later flipped to the Boston Celtics straight up in exchange for Chris Dunn, who I talked about earlier, along with Carson Edwards and a second-round pick in 2026, which was an option. For Chris Dunn, this ends his trade history. Same with Carson Edwards, matter of fact, so that pretty much ends the line there. And of course, Hernan-Gomez would be involved in a few other trades. After this, he was later flipped in a 3-team deal to the San Antonio Spurs, along with $2.15 million cash. The Denver Nuggets would tag in here, picking up Brian Forbes from San Antonio, while sending a second-round pick and $200,000 cash to San Antonio. And the Celtics would acquire from Denver Bol Bol and PJ Dozier. Now, Bol Bol and PJ Dozier were supposed to be sent to the Orlando Magic for a second-round pick in 2023, but this pick ultimately got nixed because of the fact that it was originally owned by the Phoenix Suns, and the Suns were caught tampering in one of the NBA offseasons, so this pick basically got forfeited, you could say, by the league. Brian Forbes never got traded again, and for Hernan-Gomez, the next trade of his career was one that I've already discussed, so I'm not going to go into it. Now, carrying on here, Eric Bledsoe, as I mentioned, he was later flipped by the Clippers, this time to the Portland Trailblazers, along with Justice Winslow, Keon Johnson, and a second-round pick in 2025. in exchange for Norman Powell and Robert Covington. Norman Powell would become a very solid player with the Clippers and is still with LA to this day. For the Blazers, this was the last stop for Eric Bledsoe in his trade history. Justice Winslow would also disappear from the NBA after this trade. Keon Johnson is a good young guy, but he ultimately never got traded again. And the second round pick in 2025 is still with Portland. Robert Covington, on the other hand, he would keep things going as he was later flipped in another trade involving 3 teams, going from the Clippers all the way to the Philadelphia 76ers, along with Marcus Morris, Nicholas Batum, and Kenyon Martin Jr. The Sixers would also acquire a 2024 second round pick, a first in 2028 and 2029, and a second round pick in 2029 and $2 million cash. The OKC Thunder would tag into this deal, helping the Clippers land James Harden, PJ Tucker, and Philip Petrusev from the Sixers, and the Clippers would give up a first-round pick and $1.1 million cash to OKC. Robert Covington never got traded again, and Nicholas Batum, Kenyon Martin Jr., was flipped to the Detroit Pistons, along with 2 second-round picks for future considerations. Philip Petrusev was later flipped to the Sacramento Kings, along with cash for Luka Mitrovic. This basically became a nothing trade, so to speak, so that pretty much ends the line right there. I'll come back to PJ Tucker, by the way, and for Marcus Morris, this basically ends his trade history. Of course, James Harden is still with the Clippers. Going back to the big Buddy Hield, Tristan Thompson to the Pacers for Sabonis, basically going to the Kings. Now, there are still some parts that I also need to bring up here. So after this trade, Buddy Hield was later flipped by the Pacers to the Philadelphia 76ers in a 3-team deal. Indiana would acquire Doug McDermott from the San Antonio Spurs, who tagged in as the third party here. Philadelphia would send back to Indiana Furkan Korkmaz and 2 second-round picks, one of them being conditional, and also an unknown amount of cash. And from Indiana goes Marcus Morris going to the San Antonio Spurs, and also the Sixers would send the Spurs a second-round pick in 2029 and an unknown amount of cash. Of course, Buddy Hield will later get involved in a separate trade, and the second-round pick that the Pacers got back in 2024 from Sixers would later be flipped in another deal, going to the Spurs, which the Spurs used to select Juan Nunez. It also went with some cash, and the Pacers would get back the pick that would be used to select Johnny Furphy in the 2024 second round. Furkan Korkmaz and Doug McDermott haven't been traded again. Korkmaz basically has kind of disappeared from the NBA landscape, while Doug McDermott is basically stuck as a bench warmer right now for the Pacers. And same thing goes with Marcus Morris, basically. For Buddy Hield, however, he would later get flipped in a big-time 6-team trade in which he was later sent to the Golden State Warriors. Essentially, you got the Sixers, the Timberwolves, the Warriors, the Hornets, the Mavericks, and the Nuggets getting involved here. The Sixers, all they got back was a 2031 second-round pick from Dallas. The Warriors would pick up Buddy Hield in basically a sign-in trade along with Kyle Anderson. The Timberwolves would acquire a second-round pick in 2025 from Denver, along with a pick swap in 2031 and an unknown amount of cash from the Warriors. The Nuggets would pick up an unknown amount of cash from the Charlotte Hornets, who would acquire Josh Green from Dallas, along with Reggie Jackson and 2 second-round picks from Denver. And the Warriors would send Klay Thompson to the Dallas Mavericks, along with a second-round pick in 2025 that was conditional. Of course, all of the pieces here are still with their respective teams. Well, at least most of them. I'll come back to Kyle Anderson because he is involved in another trade after this, but everything else has essentially not moved. So this is still fairly new and could very well keep things going. Going back to the James Harden trade going to the Clippers, as part of this deal, we also have something else connected here. So basically, after this, we then have PJ Tucker, as I mentioned, going from the Clippers, later flipped to the Utah Jazz, along with Mo Bamba, a second-round pick in 2030 and an unknown amount of cash value in exchange for Patty Mills and Drew Eubanks. Eubanks and Patty Mills both never got traded again from their respective clubs. And then for Mo Bamba, technically he got traded later, but it's not connected to this trade. For PJ Tucker, he would later be involved in a ginormous 6-team trade that ultimately saw the Pistons, Warriors, Heat, Jazz, and Raptors get involved. PJ Tucker ultimately goes to the Toronto Raptors here. The big part of this entire trade tree was the Warriors picking up Jimmy Butler from Miami for Andrew Wiggins, Kyle Anderson, and a first-round pick. The Raptors sent Davion Mitchell to Miami. Detroit get Dennis Schroeder from Utah, along with Lindy Waters III and a future second-round pick from the Warriors. And the Jazz would acquire Kenyon Martin Jr., Josh Richardson, and a second-round pick in 2028. All of these parts are still with their respective clubs, except for PJ Tucker, because he was bought out by the Raptors and he is now with the New York Knicks because he wanted to play for a contender. The last part of this entire thing, going back to Anthony Davis, so AD would spend a number of years with the LA Lakers. He would help them win the NBA championship in 2020. He would have a significant impact for the Lakers organization alongside LeBron James, helping them routinely make the playoffs and always be a consistent threat, at least in the minds of the media, for the NBA championship. Surprisingly enough, with the Lakers falling into pieces to a certain degree this season, they somehow got a massive lifeline, and unfortunately Anthony Davis was the sacrificial lamb, so to speak, as he was involved in what is arguably one of the biggest trades in modern NBA history, where Anthony Davis was sent to the Dallas Mavericks along with Max Christie and a first-round pick in 2029 for Luka Doncic, Maxi Kleber, and Markieff Morris, and the Utah Jazz would tag in here as a third team and would pick up Jalen Hood-Schifino and a second-round pick in 2025. This is still such a ginormous trade and is still the point of discussion for a lot of NBA controversy right now. Anthony Davis, unfortunately, his career has kind of taken a tough turn because over the last couple of seasons, he's been mostly injury prone with the Lakers, and that's probably just because of his whole history and the fact of his size and everything else. That would carry over into the Mavericks organization, as at least he has missed a good chunk of games this season. We'll see what he's like going into next year, I guess. For Max Christie, he is currently a role player with the Mavericks, who, of course, are kind of using him as best they could, along with the first round pick in 2029. Doncic would click perfectly with LeBron in the Lakers organization, Maxi Kleber, Markieff Morris being more of like minor pieces of this deal. And of course, Jalen Hood-Schifino and the second round pick haven't been traded since by Utah. So as you can see, this took a lot of work to make. So I would really appreciate all of your support. If you watched this entire video through, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like. It takes 2 seconds. Subscribe to the channel for more content if you like this one, and I'll see you all in my next video.